Thank you all for being here, and welcome to the launch of our Community Engagement and Climate Equity Framework and Toolkit. I'm Jane Stricker, Senior Vice President for Energy Transition at the Greater Houston Partnership and Executive Director of what we call HETI, the Houston Energy Transition Initiative. We're really pleased that you could join us for the launch of this really important piece of work. And the report we'll be discussing today is now available for download on our HETI website, and Sophia will put a link in the chat. Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure today to be joined by a really great group of speakers, including John Hall, President and CEO of the Houston Advanced Research Center, or HARC, Dr. Sallie Greenberg, Principal at Sallie Greenberg Consulting, and Dr. Stephanie Piper, Senior Research Assistant for Climate and Equity at HARC. Next. So our agenda for today's session includes a bit of background and context on HETI and the Greater Houston Partnership, an overview of the climate equity project that enabled the development of this framework and report, and a moderated panel discussion with the research team, as well as some Q&A at the end. This is really meant to be the starting point of the discussion. We know we're not going to get to every question or every topic in depth today. Really, this is meant to be a launch pad for this report and this work, and we really look forward to driving the conversation forward for Houston with this as our starting point. So the Greater Houston Partnership, for those who are not familiar, the Greater Houston Partnership is the primary business organization for the Houston region. We are a collection of industry, academic, and other organizations that are really dedicated to the economic growth of the Houston region. And so in 2021, HETI was created as an opportunity to really drive Houston's leadership in the energy industry, drive sustainable and equitable economic growth for an energy transition that is both energy abundant and low carbon. And so, the purpose is really about ensuring that as we make this transition to a lower carbon energy future, that we're doing it in a way that creates economic opportunity for all Houstonians. And so when we think about what role community plays in that work, HETI is, brought together and supported by a number of industry leaders, but we also have an advisory board that sits alongside that represents city and county government, community organizations, as well as NGOs and other trade associations, and our universities and colleges, to really help us think about ensuring that as this work moves forward, it is moving forward in a way that creates benefit and opportunity for everyone. So last summer, we engaged HARC and Sallie Greenberg Consulting to help us really explore that intersection of energy transition and community engagement. And we asked them to help us create a collaborative framework to support both our companies and our communities in advancing solutions for an equitable energy transition. The team has done, I believe, a truly outstanding job working with both industry members and community members to develop this report and framework. And it's my pleasure now to hand the mic over to John Hall at HARC to share some opening thoughts.
Thank you, Jane, and let me begin by thanking you and the Greater Houston Partnership and HETI for the opportunity to collaborate with you on this very important work. For those of us who have the opportunity to work on the energy transition issues, we find ourselves talking a lot about community engagement. And thought it would be useful to talk about what is it, and perhaps a good starting point is what it is not. It is not one-way communication. It is not periodic meetings that energy companies may convene to inform communities of their plans to expand an existing facility or build a new one. And it is not just to focus on issues of concern by energy companies, however well-intentioned, such as the long-term, the industry's focus on STEM and workforce issues over time. It is, however, It involves two-way communication. It is deliberate, intentional, and ongoing, aimed at building trust and positive working relationships between community and industry. It is a place where it is a process by which all of us are challenged to listen to each other and to come to understand our respective concerns, particularly those fence line communities that are in close proximity to industry facilities and energy infrastructure. It also is focused on uplifting and focusing on issues that are of particular concern to communities. In my view, prioritizing those concerns from those individuals who live in those fence line communities. And as you interact with those community folks, you realize very quickly that their concerns are centered on the issues of environmental, energy, and economic equity. They recognize the importance of energy in their communities, but are concerned legitimately that while they have borne many of the negative impacts or the externalities of energy in their communities, they believe very strongly that they have not participated in the benefits that energy provides to society as a whole. As we move forward, we have the opportunity, because of the federal government's focus on community engagement and community benefits, to reassess how we approach these very important issues. Community folks are not just interested in talking and becoming acquainted with folks in the industry, however important that is. They are interested in engaging constructive dialogue aimed at delivering meaningful benefits that will improve the quality of their lives as well as their neighbors. While much of the attention on community engagement today relates to what the federal government has established through its Justice 40 initiative, my experience in working in communities over the past 20 years has taught me that what the federal government has done through its community engagement and Justice 40 initiatives is to simply give voice to the concerns that fence line communities have had for years. And that is to have ongoing communication with their industrial neighbors, to help them understand the concerns and the interests that they may have, and to form lasting partnerships so that the transformative change that they want to see in their own lives and their communities may be addressed in an ongoing manner, where they work side by side with industry to co-develop solutions for the problems that they have to deal with daily. And it's changing. I mean, the whole process of community engagement is changing. Many companies have had ongoing communication with communities that are in proximity to them for years. But today we're being challenged to do more, to be more systematic in our work, and to be intentional in ensuring that as part of this energy transition, which will leverage billions, if not trillions of dollars, to use this once-in-a-generation opportunity to deliver meaningful employment, environmental, and other economic benefits to these communities. Next slide, please. And of course, environmental justice has been around as a major issue of concern going back to the Clinton administration for almost 30 years now. Environmental justice has to do with the fair treatment of all individuals despite income, ethnicity, or race, to receive the benefits of energy that are extensive across our society. And the stakeholder engagement can be complex and challenging, but if we are willing to invest the time to get to know each other, if energy companies place a priority of establishing positive working relationships with their neighbors, come to understand their concerns, place an emphasis on figuring out effective ways to address their concerns, and delivering those benefits, those substantial benefits that energy companies provide, we can bring about transformative change in fence line communities. And for energy companies, create new customers to buy their products and thereby increase their profits. So I think one of the challenges we face today is how do we move forward to embrace the challenges of community engagement and community benefits that communities are especially concerned about. I would offer a challenge for us to consider, and that is, while we move forward to comply with federal justice voting requirements, we embrace the fact that all benefit from fence line communities being strong supporters of energy, especially since the demand for energy is increasing. I firmly believe that if we embrace community engagement and the delivery of community benefits to fence line communities, we can, of course, address effectively environmental justice concerns and other equity issues, but also have folks who live in these communities become our biggest champions. And I would suggest, therefore, that regardless of federal policy, it would be wise for us to fully embrace and institutionalize the equity-centered community engagement processes and efforts that has been mandated by the Biden administration's Executive Order 14008. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions that may come.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sallie Greenberg, and it's been my pleasure to work in conjunction with HARC and with the Greater Houston Partnership and the Houston Energy Transition Initiative. This has been a labor of love for several of us, and it's really a distinct pleasure to be able to present on it today. I think that John's remarks really set the stage very well for the landscape under which this study, toolkit, and framework were designed and hopefully soon to be implemented. We have seen a big shift in stakeholder engagement, the expectations, and the requirements over the last several years. There's a distinction to be made between what is expected and being driven from the federal government through Biden's Executive Order 14008, which established the Justice 40 Initiative. And I'll go into a little bit of detail here in just a moment. But what that initiative does and how it has been facilitated through the federal government is that it sets direction for federally funded activities. But what we're seeing is that in the absence of other directives or previously just best practices, which are robust, however, don't go far enough to address equity and concerns as expressed or shared in John's remarks. But what we're seeing is that what is being expected at the federal level has the potential to drive engagement activities beyond federal expectations. And so that is a significant shift in the landscape of what can be anticipated in terms of community engagement. And you'll hear us talk a lot about community engagement, stakeholder engagement, community benefits plans. And as John said, and as it says on the slide here, that stakeholder engagement is complex and it's interwoven. There's demands to engage more people in more ways. We certainly heard a lot of that during the course of this study. There's increasing expectations about having engagement, what engagement is, and who should be involved and how that involvement works. But what I see for the first time in maybe the 25 years that I've been working in this space is that we have a significant opportunity right now to change how we work in communities and how we work with communities, and to really enter in a partnership to be able to drive equitable energy transition activities forward. Now, there's always the potential for conflicting viewpoints and concepts about direction, benefits, and progress, but it's my belief that this framework and toolkit start us in the space of having hard conversations and challenging opportunities to figure out how we can work together to provide energy for the future, protect the environment, and deliver that in equitable and fair ways. Next. Let me speak a little bit about the U.S. Federal Justice 40 Initiative. So the Justice 40 Initiative calls for 40% of federal investment in certain covered programs of the federal government flow to communities that are named disadvantaged communities by the federal government. So the question comes into play of how do we define disadvantaged communities? How do we define Justice 40 investments? And how do we measure and track that the benefits of those investments are actually happening? So the covered programs include climate change programs, climate energy efficiency programs, affordable and sustainable housing, clean transportation, training and workforce development related to clean energy and renewable energies, clean water and waste infrastructure, and remediation and reduction of legacy pollution. So you can see it's quite an investment in the energy transition and in delivering energy in better and more sustainable ways. The types of investments that are covered are federal grants and procurement spending, financing such as loan guarantees, programmatic federal staffing costs, direct financial benefits, and additional federal investments under covered programs as determined by the Office of Management and Budget. Next. So let's talk a little bit about disadvantaged communities, or the definition thereof. Disadvantaged communities can include a group of individuals living in geographic proximity or geographically dispersed set of individuals where either the type of group experience and common conditions are measurable through metrics, mappable through data, and are identifiable by census tract. And if you're familiar with this, we get into this later in the presentation. There are several tools and databases that have been developed to help determine whether or not communities fit into these criteria. The Department of Energy looked across 36 burden indicators in 4 categories. Those 4 categories are dependence on fossil fuels, energy burden, environmental and climate hazards, and socioeconomic vulnerabilities. That can include data such as unemployment, particulate matter of 2.5 and above, fossil energy employment, access to jobs, incomplete plumbing, cancer potential, whether or not a community is in a food desert, internet access, climate hazard, and many, many other indicators. So all of that goes into the tools and the determination of communities, primarily from census data, but other data as well, and then is mappable in a way that communities are designated as disadvantaged communities. What the recipient of federal funding is then required to do is to state the ways in which they anticipate benefits and harms to flow to communities, and to identify those, speak to how they plan to mitigate potential harm, and how they plan to develop the opportunity for benefits. Next. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Piper. She's going to talk in detail about the study, the framework, and the toolkit, with the understanding that our objective going in was to understand the best practices of community engagement, build a knowledge base for applying that to the Houston region for the energy transition. Stephanie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sallie, for that background on Justice 40 and all the, setting that landscape that we're in right now. So a research question specifically was looking at, indicators like two-way engagement, John brought that up as well, that contribute to an equitable energy transition. So what would make that transition equitable? And then how does this differ between member companies for HETI and community members? And so what are kind of the disconnects when we're looking at community engagement? And so this is the work plan that we followed. So this first phase, this design, the design is just what does this collaborative project look like, really framing the concepts. This also included a literature review of existing best practices of community engagement and climate equity, and also identifying current community engagement paradigms. What is the system at play that we're looking at, and what is shifting within that system? And then in phase 2, we get into that exploration phase, looking at that current state of engagement. And this is when we talk to both industry and community members in interviews to understand what they were currently doing for community engagement, what they were looking for, what they thought the gaps were. And so we used interviews and other social science methods along with Justice 40 analysis and use that to analyze the interviews and find iterative feedback to kind of understand that current state, and then move into that framework phase, which is where we applied that information. And that's when we really put together the framework and the toolkit, which are both tailored to Houston area energy companies to provide a kind of a roadmap to improved community engagement. And so these are our key findings from the report. The report itself on HETI's website will have more details, but this is kind of the core of what we found, is that many energy companies have these really strong existing community engagement and support activities, but they can be leveraged and enhanced. So as both John and Sallie pointed out, there has been a shift in expectations of engagement and what the community is looking for. And so while these community engagement activities that have been going on for a long time at these companies, particularly ones that lean towards STEM education, workforce development, and charitable contributions, those are not necessarily what the community is currently looking for. And, we're lucky as well that companies have these dedicated staff and budgets and follow these industry standards that are out there. And so what we want to do is take that really strong foundation and improve that for deeper engagement on climate equity. So one of the things that came really strong through this is working on two-way communication. So meaningful engagement will require a shift from informing and consulting with communities to more involvement and collaboration when working through these project processes. And some of that also includes shared definitions. So what does climate equity and community engagement mean to companies and communities, and making sure that, climate equity is addressing this wide range of indicators and concerns, including things like job creation, reducing energy costs, and community health and resilience. So making sure that the existing strengths we have are leveraged to reach what the community is looking for in this kind of new landscape of community engagement. And so that is what informed the framework and the toolkit. These are two sections of this final report that is coming out. So the framework itself is outlining that current state of community engagement, what we found from those interviews with companies and communities, and looking at it as an enabler of climate equity in Greater Houston, particularly connected to decarbonization. Whereas the toolkit provides more direct resources and information for how to start working in or improve those current practices. So giving resources to kind of set that stage as you're building your community engagement work. And so the framework is broken down into this concept map. So starting at this community engagement stage that we're currently working in, so what a company's current practices are that they can build on. So like I said, many companies have robust community engagement programs that they've been putting investment into for a long time. And those activities are focused primarily on workforce development, STEM education, and charitable contributions. But equity considerations have become more important for the community in recent years and for companies as well. And so how to take what is already being done and build it into equitable community engagement. And so what would that look like? We consider things like two-way engagement and transparency between the company and the community, and that helps to improve trust flow and improve trust in the community and openness to working together. Engaging often, so John touched on this as well, we're not talking about periodic meetings, we're talking about regularly returning to the same community and keeping their feedback in the loop as you move forward, as well as improving benefit flows to underserved communities, groups like those on the fence line who may not necessarily be gaining all the benefits that energy as an industry is providing to the grander community. And also an investment in local voices, looking at these kind of local community members as experts in their lived experiences and how they see engagement needs shifting. And then asking communities what concerns they want addressed and tailoring your engagement to address their concerns and alleviate pressures on them while also, building into your company's needs. And so equitable community engagement over time leads to and is informed by co-created solutions. And so when we're talking about a solution that's co-created, we think about things like specific metrics and accountability. So being sure that you're able to measure whether a community engagement activity is successful, what you gained from it, what the community gained. And part of that is soliciting and incorporating community feedback, again, with these sustained relationships and going back to the same communities, as well as providing education so the community has the information they need to share feedback. Community members are not as familiar with the project process of your company as you are, and they won't know what feedback to share until they understand the process itself. And so being clear that that education is part of that engagement, as well as, again, shared language and definitions, making sure there is this open trust ability to be able to collaborate in that way. And so the framework is a guide to both begin and improve existing community engagement work. So if you're newer to the community engagement work, this should provide a good background on what the existing practices are. But also if you're already, well practiced in community engagement at your company, this can help understand where the community saw gaps, where other companies saw gaps that you can leverage to build your work. It's also best practices that represent the current engagement landscape. So as Sallie mentioned, this change in the last several years is what we're trying to show in here. And then this is also outlining best practices specific to the Houston area. This report is Houston focused, so we want it to be as relevant to your work as possible. And then the second part of this report is the community engagement toolkit. And so the toolkit is providing direct resources and information on how to start, or again, how to improve your community engagement and climate equity practices. And so there are a number of different sections of the toolkit outlined here. We have sections on identifying community stakeholders, how to sustain two-way engagement, how to build trust with communities, how to develop and navigate those community benefits plans and agreements, how to navigate those environmental justice resources, get the data that is out there and understand how to pull it together, and then also evaluating your success of your engagement and how you go about determining those metrics that you would use. And so when we talk about identifying stakeholders, one of the main things we suggest in this toolkit is a shift from traditional stakeholder mapping. So traditional stakeholder mapping looks at the power of a community versus the interest. This tends to leave off marginalized groups who their power can be limited in certain circles. And so we shift to instead a level impacted versus interest. And so even communities that are on low on the impact level and low on the interest still benefit from making project information transparent and available, whereas high impact and high interest, that's where you really want those formal structures to participate and to provide feedback and really keep them in those long-term relationships with the company. And then we also look at mechanisms and how to approach two-way engagement. So one of the main tools we highlight here is this, spectrum of public participation. And so what most companies through the interviews we talk to are most familiar with and most well practiced in are those inform and consult levels. Those are these types of one-way engagement where it's the community, where it's the company informing the community of what's going on, those, just education events. And then consulting, that's when the community is sharing their thoughts with the community. What, we recommend considering a shift to is that kind of involved level where there is this back and forth between the company and the community, or that collaboration where you have, coalitions that work together. And then the empower stage is when it's very circular, everyone is involved. And I'll point out here, this is not meant to be a spectrum from worst to best community engagement. Each of these types of engagement certainly has their place depending on the program. And so what the toolkit really wants to lay out is that there are these other options and types of engagement, but it really is dependent on project and making sure that you're considering what's best for your company and your community at any given project. We do recommend two-way engagement in most cases, but keep in mind that this is not saying you should never take that inform or consult approach. There is a spectrum of what's needed for engagement. And then the next part we talk about is building trust with communities. So given the environmental justice concerns in communities, there can be limited trust when working with companies. And we want to make sure that companies are well equipped to address that. And a couple of things that we, recommend are providing these places where they can engage, making sure access to those venues for engagement is open to wide members of the community. We also recommend, working very diligently on transparency, being very clear if you can't address a community concern, sharing that when you can, making sure that their expectations are realistic with what you're able to complete and keeping them informed with when things change. And then that follow through, again, those sustained relationships, being sure to follow up on requests for information or on feedback that they gave and why you could or could not incorporate it. And that over time helps to build trust with these community groups. And then we also have a section outlining community benefits plans and agreements. These are a tool developed by the Department of Energy. And these are, I'll point out, required for if you have federal funding in some cases, but you don't have to do them if it's not federal funding. We do still think they're a really beneficial tool to use to kind of map out what you want the community to see. So we understand that you may not have to complete these, but we recommend, looking into these as a tool for your own mapping and understanding. And that's something to be said for Justice 40 as a whole. You're not necessarily required to follow all those different types of indicators and different types of work if you're not under federal funding, but still provides a good baseline of what is out there and what could be planned for when you're doing these activities. And so community benefits plans and agreements are one part of that, where they are frameworks that can help ensure community engagement includes workforce development benefits, reaching desired audiences, and reinvesting benefits from the energy transition. And for when they're required by DOE, CBPs should be co-developed by community organizations and the companies. And if you take this approach, that co-development is really helpful to make that a strong benefit plan, because it outlines the community priorities for a project and the company's commitment to those priorities, what they're capable of building into the project, and what might be, on a wish list for later when there's additional funding available, anything like that. And so the CBP framework consists of 4 categories, including implementing Justice 40, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, good jobs, and workforce and community agreements. And so there are benefits that can fall under each of these. In a required community benefits plan, you would have benefits falling in each of these categories. If you are working kind of with it just as a framework, you can put extra weight on certain priorities and kind of use it as a design for your own project planning. The next tool that we include is kind of a map of the environmental justice resources available. These are 2 examples. There are more databases online. On the left is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, and this provides information on whether an area is characterized as disadvantaged. It also has a lot of data on what indicators led to it being considered disadvantaged, what are kind of the main data-driven concerns the community, what kind of the socioeconomic status is. So this provides a lot of helpful data if you're looking to identify a community or what in a community might be of concern based on, federal data. And then the DOE Energy Justice Dashboard, again, helps to highlight where these disadvantaged communities are, but also includes indicators from data like Environmental Justice Screen. And so these are just 2 ways to kind of get information on a community that provide data from a number of sources in one place so you can more easily access it than looking for it across multiple databases. And then finally, we talk about the evaluation process in the toolkit. And so looking at iterative evaluation of your project or program, which includes community and stakeholder feedback at each step. So as you're going through engagement, designing, and improving the program, that you're continually soliciting and incorporating community and stakeholder feedback. So you have insights into how well the project is working, how well the engagement process is going, and how you can improve it in the future on other projects. And so the key takeaways we want you to take from this report: companies can leverage existing strengths for deeper community engagement. We don't want to undersell the work that companies are already doing, but with a changing landscape, deeper community engagement and changing expectations means that some of those strengths need to be leveraged and built upon. And so the tools provided in this report and the federal programs can be a guide to improved community engagement. This report is not meant to be a checklist where you have to fill out each section of the toolkit and your engagement will be complete. These mainly set the resources up so you're able to choose what makes sense for your company and your project and how to build on your community engagement work. And finally, that climate equity and community engagement are iterative processes, and that you will need to have a slow process of going back and learning from what you've gone through and how you can build on these programs over time. It's not meant to be, a final design that will work every time. They will shift with each community and each project. And the full report is available online that will go into detail on each of these tools and the framework itself. And so with that, we'll shift to this Q&A and discussion section. I believe Jane will kick us off with a couple of questions, and then it'll be open to more questions from the chat.
Thanks, Stephanie and Sally and John, for walking everyone through that. Before we jump into some of the specific questions, I was just wondering, either Stephanie or Sally, could one or both of you just provide a little bit more detail around when you conducted this work, engaging with both communities and companies, sort of what that process looked like, and how many different companies and community organizations or representatives did we bring into this work?
Stephanie.
I was going to say I can take that. So we had interviews with 11 companies and 10 community groups, or community members. We looked at both, larger CBOs, but also single community members. And those were interviews that we asked the same questions. We went through what their concerns were, what their current practices were, how they thought improvements could be built in, what they thought would be most productive in a toolkit or framework like this, and aggregated those interviews to pull out major themes and use those themes to inform those findings.
Jane,
Fantastic.
I'd just like to add that even in the interviewing process and the data collection process, we did take an iterative approach. So there were a few companies that we went to initially to pilot the questions that we had and to understand company and community perspectives, not just companies, refined the questions that we asked, and then went back and asked a broader collection of those groups in order to inform the study.
Thanks for that. One question I did want to check in on was, in your experience, can you speak to the community engagement practices and what's sort of unique in the Houston area? Sallie, this one's for you, because I think you've got this broad sort of global perspective, having worked on projects and with organizations around the world. And so from your vantage point, what's specifically sort of unique about how this is coming together or playing out in Houston?
Great question. So I think that you have several factors happening that are specific to Houston. First of all, you have a significant amount of energy industry communities who have long historical background with energy production or refining in their in their communities, in their neighborhoods. You have significant fence line communities. You have the whole gamut, but everybody is very, very familiar with energy and energy production and energy use and energy impacts. And that is not necessarily the case in other places. And so you also have a lot of people who have their jobs are related to energy, and they're concerned about, do I keep my job? Will I get another good job? Or, what happens as we start to transition, or are we transitioning? Is this just the beginning? Is this the end? I think all of those things, you have an incredibly sophisticated audience for across the stakeholder spectrum in Houston. And you have a significant amount of economic opportunity, and that is a driver, but you also have the potential for significant policy and protective types of activities in terms of regulations. You have a very sophisticated state system for that, as well as the federal regulations in terms of energy factored on top of that. And you have the will, you have the means, you have the opportunities to put a lot of things into play in Houston, but you also face some pretty significant challenges specific to historical equity conversations, challenges, experiences. So I think what sets Houston apart is the degree to which the opportunity can be met and the challenge to which it's going to take you to get there. But if you have people aligned, then, and Houston is good for that, then you can move forward in really, really significant ways and be a global example of how this can be done.
Thanks for that, Sallie. I appreciate it. Stephanie, one question for you. Can you expand a little bit on investing in local voices and how you can best identify which of the many local voices? I think sometimes industry, I know for myself, having worked in industry, it can feel overwhelming because you don't know who you should be engaging and who you shouldn't be engaging in. And it can almost feel like a never-ending cycle if you've not sort of identified all the right people. So how do you go about identifying those right local voices that need to be brought in?
Yeah, and that's certainly a challenge when you're designing a project of who do you want to engage with, who should you engage with. And I think there's this fear on the industry side of those missteps. And that's one of the things that I think the transparency is so important when you're reaching out to these groups and sharing when new to engaging with this community, who do we reach out to? One of the things we talk about in the report as well is this idea of community gatekeepers, and that there are these, community leaders who, if you reach out to them, they can also help reach into the community. It helps to engage with someone who's already a central figure and who can help, lend some of their trust to you and reach out to smaller groups that you might not be aware of. A lot of these community groups and these civically minded groups, whether they're, directly environmental related or whatever focus you're looking at, these civically minded groups are well connected within the community and do work together. And so being willing to, when you're talking with a community member, to be open to asking, who else should I talk to? People are very open with who they think would be a great fit for things, and also who they think would be most, willing to work on what you're working on. That's also part of it, is what capacity do they have and what would they need to work with you? What would they want to meet with you? That openness and being able to share what you're looking for, what you're able to provide. One of the things we talk about as well is being clear that you're building a relationship before you come in with a direct ask. That can be off-putting to some community members, is making sure that you make it clear that you're there for long-term and sustained engagement efforts and communication rather than a direct need at one given time.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sallie, another question that came through: how should community engagement change or evolve throughout the life cycle of a project? So, we talk about we're at the very beginning of some of this work, but we're likely to see these projects take a significant amount of time. So how does that engagement evolve over time?
That's also a great question, and it's complicated because it's hard to sustain interest or relevance over the course of a project or something that takes 20, 30 years. And so you need to, as Stephanie was just talking about, have a relationship or have relationships in communities that continue to evolve over the course of the project. Who you're talking to and engaging with at the beginning of a project may not be who you're talking to or engaged with in the middle of a project, or when you get to the end. One of the things that we found in some of the work that I've done is that we thought in an area that everybody knew about the project, and that it had, once it had been going for 10 years, that we didn't really need to continue with what we considered preliminary engagement. And it turned out that, many of the local leaders had changed, or the legislative group was different. So, every 3 to 5 years, you need to be assessing whether or not your major stakeholders have changed, if there's additional entities that you want to be or need to be engaging with. It's very helpful to have a long-term person in the community, such as a community liaison, who can help address those kinds of questions. This is why we talk about in the toolkit evaluation and an iterative process, so that you're continuing to have an opportunity to look at engagement and from new lenses or new individuals, new groups. But you also have to be very, very cognizant of engagement fatigue. And that is, if you are continually going to communities or want to talk about a nuance of a project or something that's new or different.
I think we maybe just
Yeah, well, it's just very suspenseful.
We'll come back to Sallie. In the meantime, Stephanie, one question that came up was, a question around, clearly without any putting any confidential information out there, just elaborate on who from the community side you engaged with it. Was it community leaders? Was it folks in those communities? Sort of what was the approach that you took on the community side?
Yeah, we talked primarily to leaders of community-based organizations. So people who live within the community or are from a certain community and now lead, larger groups that focus on work within that community. We also talked to a couple community engagement experts who are more on the research side of it. But we focused, I believe in that question it asked about, local leaders. We didn't talk to like city council type leaders. We focused more on those, NGOs, community-based organization type groups.
Fantastic. And so, Stephanie, from your perspective, what are some of the critical components that you see for industry to consider as they're starting to think about deploying these energy projects in the region?
Yeah, I think the main ones that, we talk about this kind of group of two-way engagement and trust building. And I think that open transparency goes a long way with the community, being very aware of what you are able to promise. And I think setting those expectations early. I think a lot of the community members we talk to, understand not everything they hope for may get accomplished, but if there's something that is off the table for whatever reason, making clear that why that is and making that available helps a lot for them to, set their expectations. And there's also in a lot of the groups we talked to, they were not well aware of existing community engagement work. So even though there are meetings happening in certain communities, being very active in how you advertise those and put that information out there. One of the people we talked to, they talked a lot about kind of a local newspaper, which is where a lot of the community got their information, which is just not a place you would necessarily think to advertise. And that's one of those things that it helps to have that community gatekeeper in your corner to highlight those avenues where people are most likely to see things and, making things accessible. I know we talked this, I believe was on a separate project, but where meetings for a community may be placed further outside that community. And if you're in a place where there's limited transportation access, it makes it very difficult for that community member to reach and share feedback. So being very cognizant of those concerns and, how you can make it as easy as possible for a community member to share their concerns and being open to those. It can be a very hard process at first. And I think particularly you don't want the community to think you're not doing your best. You don't want the community to think that you don't care about them. And I think that's a concern across industry of not feeling like the community sees the work you're doing. And I think being as open as possible helps to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there were a couple learnings early in this work when we, one of the things we did when we were first kicking off this work was talked with our advisory board for HETI. And on that advisory board were organizations like United Way and Baker Ripley, who have a long history of engaging very close on the ground with communities. And it was really helpful for me to hear them say, you don't have to have every answer. I think sometimes we have gotten in this mindset of we have to be able to answer every single question that comes our way before we can go in and engage. Because if we don't have the answer, then they won't trust us, or we will be seen as not knowing what we're doing. And I think being a little bit more aware of how important it is for the honesty and transparency to be able to say, actually, we don't have an answer to that question yet, but thank you for asking it, and let's figure that out, is a great way of building that relationship. And so I think that's been a big learning for me over the past year is really how do you sort of get past that fear of being asked what you can't answer, and being willing to say, these are things that we need to figure out together. Sallie, one other question I wanted to ask you. There's some a few things in the toolkit around how how you can get those who are probably least likely to be able to be voices, either because they are, to Stephanie's point earlier, they live too far away. Childcare becomes an issue for them to be able to participate in these community meetings. There are barriers that exist in some communities for some community members, and the recommendation in the report around compensating people for that time. And I think at first you can feel, oh, we're going to pay people to come tell us what they think. But, you know, I think it would just be helpful to sort of talk about the context of that recommendation, Sallie, and what sort of drives that.
Sure. I think if we have to remember that we're asking people to give up their time, whether that time be during the day or in the evening when they have other things that they need to be doing. Stephanie mentioned transportation, childcare, you know, access to the internet. I mean, there's a lot of ways that participation can, where there can be barriers to participation. And so compensation can come in many forms. You know, as a function of this study, we gave gift cards as in recognition of the fact that we were asking people to give us their time. Some people refused those, some people accepted them. Certainly hosting a meeting in a location which is convenient for the community, providing childcare, transportation, access to materials that are accessible, all of you know, in specific languages, paying for a translator. All of those things are a way of ensuring that you can compensate and respect. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it is a show of respect, that you respect people's time and their you know, that their opinion is valued and that you want their participation. And so compensation in some way takes, like I said, it takes many forms, and but it should be considered. The other side of that is that you should always ensure that any compensation is being considered or shared in equitable and ethical ways.
Thanks for that, Sallie. Stephanie or Sallie, there was a question about how can organizations put in place tools to assess success in community engagement, regardless of whether or not they're implementing a specific Justice 40 program or a community benefits agreement. Are there resources and guidance out there on, if, you know, how do I put the right tool or the right metrics in place for me to measure the success of my program if I'm not doing this under sort of a federal requirement?
So Stephanie, I'll start and you can
No,
add.
I think that's a Sallie question.
So the first thing I would say is that program evaluation, whether that be formative, in progress, or summative, at the end is a very powerful tool for establishing the metrics that you're going to use to measure success. You can use logic models, you can hire third-party evaluators to help you with those efforts. The Department of Energy and others talk a lot about SMART goals. So goals that are measurable, actionable, and, you know, can be tracked and measured. And those are things that you can develop in consultation with communities. What are the things that they would like to see measured? What data would they like to have available? How can you, you know, what are your objectives? How do you measure success? So anything that allows you to set a design in place of what are important things to measure, and then go ahead and measure those. and also make that data available and transparent, whether that be sharing it through a website or reports to the community and that sort of thing. So program evaluation is a really great place to start, but it is by no means the only way to measure. And when it comes to the federal government and the Justice 40 initiative, they are asking, when you submit proposals, to be very specific about your project and what the potential metrics you're going to use to measure your success. So it is not a one size fits all. It's very, very specific to the location and the community benefit plan that you have in place, and what it is that is important to that community.
So Sally, just a quick follow on. So that would suggest that before you're even submitting a grant application, that engagement should be, those relationships should be developed and that engagement should be underway, because ideally that would be a very an aligned set of objectives and metrics that goes in as part of that grant application.
So yes, but I think that gets it's really specific to what and where you're doing things.
Right.
Do you have pre-existing relationships in the community? Has the company that's doing a project, have they been there? What infrastructure is in place? Are you relying on business as usual, or do you need to seek out new stakeholders? I mean, there's a lot that goes into the stakeholder analysis component of designing a strategy for engagement. I think it's very difficult, and Stephanie mentioned this earlier, to go in cold and start talking to communities, but it's also really hard to go in when you're not talking about something specific, because that can get misconstrued as making promises or about not having enough detail, which makes people uncomfortable and nervous. So it's really a nuanced component. But as you yourself said in your remarks a little while ago, it doesn't mean just because you're afraid to start, you shouldn't do it. So I would say that it's unlikely you would have your complete plan 100% locked in, designed before you submitted a proposal, but you can lay out the framework and the way that you're going to work and the things that you're going to do and the checkpoints and the iterative points and ways in which you're going to continue to refine and evolve your engagement strategy as you go. But you do have to start somewhere, and most likely that means having conversations before you put in a proposal to do a project somewhere.
Yeah. I guess one of the questions that came up has to do with, a recognition that for a lot of this work and the companies that were engaged, they're large companies that have been doing energy work in these communities for quite some time, have had operations. One of the interesting things with the energy transition is there's going to be a lot of new company formation, a lot of new project development. And so where in the study would you point sort of smaller companies and startups who may not have a background in doing big energy projects, but recognize that if they want to be successful in executing projects as part of the energy transition, they really need to learn how to do this well?
So I would point them to the climate equity framework and toolkit as a start, but there's also many other resources available. Good work came out of the World Resources Institute the Department of Energy. There's ICF has good best practices. There's a lot of community engagement best practice work that is out there and is very, very sound. My other suggestion would be to partner with academics or other groups that have been engaged in these kinds of activities, whether that be through a advisory capacity or some other component. I think it cannot be understated how valuable it is to have somebody on your team that looks at things from a social lens, and that can be environmental, regulatory, and social, or it can be just from a social landscape, because one of the challenges that you're going to find with a lot of these energy transition opportunities is it's not just about the technology. In fact, in many, many cases, it's really not about the technology. It's about how are you going to deploy in and with communities. And so investment in, external affairs or somebody who's got that lens is super, super important.
And I'll also
Thanks,
add to that, Sallie, that within the framework and toolkit itself, starting with how to identify stakeholders and kind of where you would look, that tool is particularly helpful. But also in a number of those sections, they end with questions to ask yourself as you're moving forward with identifying stakeholders, or how you're building trust, how to approach 2A engagement. And so those questions can kind of serve as a good starting point for people who are new to the engagement side or smaller companies, and which questions are most relevant to what they're looking at, and kind of how do you start that process.
Stephanie, one question for you was, in addition to the federal tools that you identified, were there any studies that you've looked at that look very specifically at Harris County or City of Houston in terms of engagement or disparities or identification of disadvantaged communities that could be a resource for folks?
Yeah, there are a number of projects happening within the City of Houston. I'm blanking on what year it came out, but the Climate Resilience Plan is relatively recent and provides a good overview of work to be done in Houston. There's also a number of community-based organizations that put out reports on their concerns about the area. I know Airlines Houston has put out some data on air pollution in the area that also highlights certain communities, and as well as heat mapping programs and things like that. And HARC has a number of reports out on our website that look at some of these issues within the City of Houston as well, that outline specific concerns, along with highlighting where disadvantaged communities fall in the city and how they're affected. But those large scale environmental justice resources will provide the most bird's eye view and can help as you zoom in within Houston as well.
Sure. Thanks for that. And then any guidance or lessons learned or best practices for if you're going to use a consultant or an external firm to help support your community engagement efforts?
Sorry, go ahead, John.
I will add this. If you're going to hire a consultant, make sure you take the time to select someone who has spent time engaging with communities, has built relationships, has developed trust, so that your efforts to do the right thing doesn't become a transactional process, which the community folks may be offended by.
That's a great point, John, which is essentially what led us to HARC to really kick off this work along with Sallie. Was an organization that has a really long history of doing great energy projects in communities in the region. And then Sallie having such extensive experience globally on working on various projects in different kinds of communities. So I think that's great guidance. Anything, Stephanie or Sallie, that you would add to that?
I think I would add that I would be very involved. I think that it is not a role or an activity that you want to outsource. You as a company or as an individual, as a researcher, whatever your role is, you need to have people that understand the project from the inside and are going to be there as a resource for the community for the duration. And so while I think there are times where it is great to use a consultant, I think it can be perceived as disingenuous if you and your company are not seen as being there, involved, and on the front lines. It's not a pass-through activity.
No, great point. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. I think that we've covered most of the questions. John, I want to just ask you any final thoughts that you want to share as we get this report out. And you know, you're doing a lot of work both with Justice 40 programs and other community engagement efforts across the region. So we'd just love your thoughts on you know, this piece of work, as well as how we move forward most effectively.
This is challenging work, and it cannot be done overnight. I think if you're making a decision to engage with communities, please recognize it requires time, and it's important for you to make a commitment up front that you're going to stay the course and get to know the folks that you're connecting with, and listen a lot, and come to understand their concerns, and recognize, you know, this is for the long term. It's a process that can yield significant benefits if it is recognized that there are legitimate concerns in communities, and a commitment to work in partnership with them to address those concerns in a collaborative manner is one of the most positive things you could be doing as an energy company, because you're basically investing for the next 100 years in terms of your operations.
Thanks for that, John. Stephanie, any final thoughts from you?
No, I'm just excited to have this work out there and hope that, you know, this helps to set the stage for community engagement work being done, and helps, you know, companies look at what they're doing and take what they're doing well and build on that, and continue to support that work, and also see what is possible to continue to build.
Thanks. Sallie?
Yeah, so I think that this space continues to evolve, and I think that the sophistication of how we engage with communities and what society's objectives are in terms of energy, environment, human health, and safety, all of those things are in the mix. I agree 100% with John. This is super challenging work, but it's super important work. And what we need to do is not be looking for opportunities to convince other people that we're right, but we need to wade in, and we need to have difficult conversations, and we need to find ways to come together and align on what we can align on and march forward, instead of potentially getting bogged down by taking sides and not progressing the ideas that we need for sustainable energy and good jobs and a better future, because that's what we all want for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. But we also want to protect the environment. And, you know, it's a big ask, but we're very, very clever. And if we work together to make these sorts of things happen, then, you know, the potential is immense. And I think, again, as I said earlier, that Houston is one of the places to watch for this to happen. So it's very exciting. Thank you.
Thanks, Sallie. And I just want to thank the HARC team and Sallie Greenberg Consulting for all of the work on getting this report done. I also want to thank both the the companies that participated in the interview process, as well as the communities and community organizations and folks who are willing to be a part of this work as well. And finally, I just want to recognize Sophia Cunningham from the HETI team. She has been, she's done an amazing job of bringing all of this together, keeping this work on track and keeping our members and our advisory board engaged along the way. I'm really excited that we are getting this work out there. I think it will be a real value add for the Houston region. We want this to be something that gets used not just by our members, but by anyone who's thinking about doing energy transition work or projects, or who are already doing work here in Houston. So with that, we'll leave it there. Like I said, this is the beginning of a discussion. I certainly look forward to continuing to see the progress that we're making against these opportunities in the long term. Thanks everybody for being a part of the conversation today, and let us know what you think of the report and the toolkit and the framework. We would certainly love to get your feedback on all of it. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.